We cannot turn a blind eye to what is happening in these areas. Even if we in the West are anti religious or atheistic, we can't pretend that these events are not taking place. And when Christians attempt to defend themselves from such horrors, we simply state that they are no better than the perpetrators. Please remember that the heart of the Christian faith does not promote the killing of fellow images of God, even when they are oppressing them with unimaginable suffering. Christians are told by Christ to love their enemies and to withstand persecution and suffering. The Christians haven't started this fight and would never willfully condone it in any way, shape, or form. Some in these Christian communities have decided to fight in a defensive way for their own self preservation or just simply for the sake of their family and friends because the Muslim authorities are allowing their subjugation and genocide to continue unabated, like in places like Nigeria, in northern Nigeria. Christians are being slaughtered constantly by Boko Haram. Turning a blind eye to the systematic elimination of Christian and Jewish communities within Iraq, Egypt, or Saudi Arabia cannot be tolerated by the rest of the world. At its core, Judaism and Christianity does not support the suppression or elimination of any human person because of his religious beliefs or lack thereof. The concept of free will is paramount to both belief systems, and it is up to the individual person to either enter into or not enter into a relationship with the Most High. Offensive wars and systematic repression of those who do not share their precepts is not encouraged within their societies or communities, and this is evidenced within the political spheres that have evolved over time in nation states that have at their foundation democratic political and social institutions. At the core of the Canadian, American, and European democracies is the belief in individual freedoms and the protection of free will choices, as much as can be humanly tolerated within the confines of a Judeo Christian moral system. This is considerably lacking within the Muslim nation state environments, whose core belief systems do not believe or support the sanctity of the concept of free will. In the Quran, this principle does not exist. The story of Adam and Eve in the garden is non existent, as far as the fall is concerned, anyway. This means that original sin, free will, and the sanctity of human choice and the acceptance of God is lacking in the Quran. Without this basic understanding of human nature, we are left with a society that does not accept democracy, constitutional law, or the protection of individual freedoms. It views these things as being man made. It only accepts Sharia law and subjugation to Allah. The Arab Spring was destined to fail because the Quran only supports Sharia law and will never accept the primacy of constitutional law or the acceptance of so called rights and freedoms, since the human animal is no more than a minuscule slave and creature of their God. They believe in total submission. It's anti democratic. It's anti ism, period. The only thing that the Quran supports and that Islam supports is subjugation to Sharia law. The liberal Democrats and conservatives within the West should be very careful about granting the protection of religious freedoms to cults. What is meant by this is that if a religious belief doesn't promote the concept of free will and choices to the individual, then we should be highly suspect of such a faith, since this type of religious belief system diminishes the sacred concept of human dignity, and by disregarding every human being's inalienable right to self determination and choice, which comes from the ultimate belief in free will. This is a warning to the West and to the democracies that try to accommodate all religious beliefs under the umbrella of multiculturalism and the protection of the individual's right to his religious beliefs. This is tolerable when the religious beliefs are personal in nature and do not condone or promote an alternate set of laws that override the constitutional laws of the land. When this is allowed to occur, then it may be undermining the very nature of the supremacy of constitutional law, and that can have a very detrimental effect on the rights of the people within that community to freely express their views and their beliefs. The hijacking of the democratic system of law should never be tolerated, especially when it's done under the cover of rights of so and so's religious freedoms. If the religion does not support human rights, human freedom, or human dignity, then this should not be allowed to flourish within a democratic society in an unchallenged fashion because it undermines the sanctity of free will. Humans must have the right to sin, and they must have the right to figure things out for themselves. And this implies that a multitude of pluralism must be afforded within a just and democratic society. The right to be atheist, religious, apathetic, etc., must be allowed to exist wherever it is possible to do so, so that all people are given as much latitude as possible to decide how they would like to live their lives. The Judeo Christian God, the Alpha and the Omega, does not condone forced conversions. The relationship that you have to the I Am has to be freely entered into, or it's meaningless and hollow. We can tolerate just about anything in terms of individual beliefs, but must guide ourselves by the principles of what benefits human dignity and human rights. Humans have an inalienable right to sin. It is God given, and many times the only way is to fail and to come to grow in self awareness and enlightenment. Sin has negative consequences in our lives, but it is sometimes necessary to endure so that moral growth can take place. God always finds a way to bring something good out of evil. Even the greatest evils have had goodness come from them because God is good. No society should tolerate a belief system that does not have at its core the central concept and precept of the protection of free will. Evil exists, it is real, and those of us who recognize this must fight against it on both a global scale and within ourselves. Wherever we see evil committed against peoples by their country or by groups within a nation state that dehumanizes the individual, we must bring attention to it and work to eliminate it. The ultimate self interest of the democratic nation state is to promote democracy within all societies so that basic rights and freedoms can be had by all. In a world where there are conflicting political paradigms, this is the ultimate self interest cause for the democratic society living in the world. Wherever there is injustice or inequality, it must be confronted and called out so that human dignity can be allowed to develop, even when it is witnessed within your own democratic system of jurisprudence. Wherever the United States or Europe or Canada or Australia or other free nation states that are democratic, wherever they see injustices being committed by other countries or by other so called governmental structures, especially those that are communistic in nature or neo fascist in nature, they have to be called out. Democracy is not just a privilege for a few. And if you treat it that way, then there's a very real possibility that your democratic society will fail. There isn't an equality between cultures. Some cultures are better than others. There isn't an equality between governments. Some governments are far better than others, especially when it comes to the protection of free will, liberty, and democratic principles. The West might not be perfect, but it is the most progressive system of governance that we currently have in the world. And it should not be seen as a privilege for the few. It should be aggressively pursued everywhere in the world. We are all citizens of a broken world, a world which is not capable of perfection, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight to make it so. Whenever we have the means to make it a better place, we have a moral duty in this lifetime of ours to make the world a better place than when we were born, for the sake of our children and for the sake of all of humanity. We must not become complacent or apathetic, and we must fight to promote human dignity wherever it is lacking in our world. On a personal level, All of us have to deal with the small evil that exists and is part of our human makeup, what we call original sin. In an allegorical form, we humans are like a drinking glass that is perfect except for a hairline fracture that runs from the top of the glass to its foundation. We are all of us perfect drinking glasses, but because of this fracture, highly fragile, incapable of being shattered. Each glass is unique and special and a one of a kind, but each glass possesses this hairline fracture. As human beings, we must be aware of this within ourselves as well as within our fellow human beings, and we should thus take care when we are dealing with each other not to handle the glass too harshly, because it can shatter into a million pieces if it's slammed. All of us have a breaking point because we are not infallible and we are not perfect. Christ knew this about us, and so he encourages us to treat each other with the utmost of care and love. We begin to heal this fracture a little bit at a time as we grow in faith in the Lord. While this happens to us, we're capable of taking a little bit more abuse without breaking apart too easily. However, we must always be aware that others may not be at the same place in their faith journey and may be more susceptible to cracking. It's impossible for any of us to know how fractured anyone else is. So we must be very careful in how we treat all people, since some may appear to be solid when in fact they're quite fragile and weak. We're going to take a look at King David, the story of King David and Bathsheba, to give us a little bit of insight into God's willingness to forgive us for our sinful nature. We are all fractured, and this is the shared human condition that we all face while inhabiting this realm of our reality in this part of the universe. Although we share this fragility, we should never despair, since God is always willing and trying to bring us into a state of perfection through love. God forgave King David, so why wouldn't he be able to forgive you as well? There aren't too many sins that he would not be able to forgive, and David is a prime example of this. Before we talk about David's sin, we will tell you a little bit about David and his life. If you need to substantiate this, read the story of David and his life for yourselves in the scriptures. When David becomes king of Israel, he takes the throne by entering the city by stripping off all his clothes except for his undergarments. While music is playing and the people are laying palms at his feet, he dances his way through the crowds until he comes upon his throne, and then he sits on it. Cool guy. Imagine that, a dancing king. A king who doesn't come into the city riding a great big white horse and adorned in armor and a shield, but rather one who strips down to the barest of his humanity and comes to his throne by jubilantly dancing in the streets. David is humble and is also a wonderful poet. His poetry is all over the place in the scriptures, and we read some of it during every Mass at church in the form of his greatest works, the Psalms. David is a poet king, a dancer, a very humble, self aware human being who loved God and who God loved back. While he was king and living high above his capital city, within the structure of his temple, he was able to see the entire city from this lofty position in his home. One night, as he's gazing over the city, he notices a very beautiful woman bathing outside on a rooftop, something that would have been very common during this time, since most people would have found a little bit of privacy in doing this on the rooftop. He, however, was able to see her since his house was the highest in all the kingdom. She was very beautiful, and he was definitely interested in her, and so he asked one of his servants if they knew who she was. The servants did know her, and they told David that her name was Bathsheba. They also informed him that she was married to one of his captains in the army, and that her husband Uriah was currently off fighting a battle against the enemies of the king. Now, David had countless wives, maybe even upwards of 125 or something, but He was still interested in this babe, so he asked his servants to go over to her place the next day and to invite her over for dinner. The next day, Bathsheba came over for dinner, and they dined, and almost instantly fell head over heels for each other, even though she was already married to Uriah. They carried on as a young couple will, and after a while, Bathsheba came to David with the news that she had missed her period. She was probably pregnant with King David's child. They both went into panic mode because within this time period, adultery was a sin punishable by death. They would both be found guilty of adultery and would have definitely received the death penalty, taken outside the city walls and stoned to death. The fact that David was king would matter very little to the rabbinical reading of the law. All were equal before the Torah, and both would be punished by death. David freaked out, and because he valued his life, and more importantly, the love of and life of this woman, he wanted desperately to save her and himself from this most certain death sentence. Uriah was a captain in David's army and most certainly had 20 to 40 men under his command while fighting at the front of a war with the enemies of Israel. The enemy city was reinforced by an outer wall, and the men would certainly be fighting to try to breach the wall. David devised a plan to attempt to save Bathsheba and himself. He sent off a letter to the front with one of his couriers and delivered it to his general. The letter advised the general that he wanted a no bullshit account of what was happening with the war, and he requested that a captain like Uriah would be invited to the king's temple for dinner and render a first-hand reciting of what was going on in the battle. The general advised Uriah that he would be going home to visit the king and could get a little bit of R&R after giving the king the information that he needed, obviously. Sure enough, Uriah visited the king's home, and they had dinner together. David wined and dined him and got his true account of the war, which was very appreciated since a higher ranking officer would have probably painted a rosier picture of what was really transpiring in the battle. David's plan was to get Uriah to drink to the point where he may want to go home for a few days and spend some time with his wife and family. As the evening was ending, David told Uriah that he can go home, relax for a few days before leaving for battle once more. But much to David's surprise, Uriah said that he wouldn't be going home. Uriah told the king that if he went home at this moment, while the battle was raging on, he might jeopardize his mindset with the cares of home and his wife. His head would no longer be in battle mode, and this might endanger the lives of his men and himself, and he felt too great a connection to his men to allow this to happen. Just a true warrior. So Uriah declined the king's request and said that he would be sleeping on the palace floor and would return to the front the very next day to rejoin his company and his regiment. Uriah doesn't go home. David's plan was a failure. Uriah would not be going home to make love to his wife. He would not think that the baby coming would be his, and so the king of Bathsheba's sin would be publicly displayed, and the consequences would have followed, which was shame and adultery and punishment by death. David sent Uriah off to the front with a letter sealed by the king that could only be opened by his general. When the general received the letter, he opened it up and read that the very next day at dawn, the Israeli army was to mount a charge at the city walls of the enemy. And after an initial assault, the battle horns would sound a general retreat. Every battalion was to get the order except for Uriah and his men. The very next day, the battle was launched. The army attacked, the horns were sounded, and everyone retreated except for Uriah and his men, who didn't receive these instructions. As a consequence of this purposeful miscommunication, Uriah and his men were surrounded and slaughtered by their adversaries. Word came to David that the commander and all those under his charge had been killed. David had become a murderer of many. Within the month, David and Bathsheba were engaged and married. Within the year, she gave birth, but she gave birth to a stillborn child who never breathed life. The sin was committed by both these characters, and it was grave. And one of the initial consequences was the stillborn birth of the first child in their marriage. It's funny how God brings forth something good from such an obviously evil situation. God brings forth the birth of Solomon from this union of David and Bathsheba. The greatest and wisest of Israel's kings is the result of this unholy matrimony between David and Bathsheba. The earthly consequences do not end here, though, for the sin that they committed. A little while later, the prophet Nathan came to David with the need of counsel concerning a civil matter among the citizens of the kingdom. Now, at this time in Israel, the king, although he was considered the ruler of a free people, the Israelis, did not govern completely on his own. Uh, the head prophet, in this case Nathan, who would have been considered like a pope of the kingdom, would give counsel to the king. So Nathan went to king with this dilemma. He told a story about a rich man in the kingdom who had 100 lambs and a poor man who only had one. These men were neighbors, and the rich man was about to hold a gathering for some of his friends. They were going to celebrate with a lamb dinner, but instead of sacrificing one of his 100 sheep, he decided to go next door and take the poor man's only lamb. He used the poor fellow's lamb to celebrate a feast among his friends. What, Nathan asked, should the punishment be for such a crime? He asked King David. David replied that the rich man deserved to be put to death. Nathan informed David that he and Bathsheba both deserved to be put to death for what they had done to the poor man Uriah, who, by the way, only had the one wife of Bathsheba, unlike David, who had many wives. David threw himself to the floor and cried out, asking for God's mercy and forgiveness, for he knew he had committed a grave sin. He was thrashing himself on the floor. Nathan informed him that neither of them would face the death penalty and that God still loved David and forgave him of his sins. Yes, God forgave David, a murderer, a mass murderer, because he killed not only Uriah, but Uriah's men as well. Those guys didn't go home to their wives either. God is capable of granting his grace to whoever he wishes to grant it to, and he definitely loved David in spite of his flaws and shortcomings. He forgave David. But Nathan told him that his dream of building God's temple to house the Ark of the Covenant, which was in their possession, would not happen during his watch, and that his dream, this dream of his, would not occur, and that would be a direct consequence of the sin which he had committed against humanity and against God. More than anything else, David wanted to build a temple to the Lord to house the Ark of the Covenant. As a consequence of this unholy matrimony, that doesn't happen during his lifetime. We're punished for our sins in this life and in the next, where we're held accountable. David dies never having witnessed the creation of the temple of God, which his son Solomon manages to complete in all of its glory. David was a great poet king who wrote the Psalms that are found in Scripture. He was an outstanding military commander that you didn't want to meet on the battlefield, because when his armies were badly outnumbered, he would find a way to defeat his enemies. David was a good man, and God loved him so much. But let's not forget that David murdered Uriah and his men to cover up his own iniquities. And that was a horrendous sin. In spite of his flaws and in spite of the sins that he commits, God still forgives David. So you have to ask yourself, if he forgives a guy like David, how much more will he forgive you, who are not a murderer?